First, I want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us today for this important discussion. The fact that most Americans can safely assume the things they need will be in stock, from groceries to household goods and more, is certainly a testament to the success of the freight industry. This is especially important during the pandemic. Deliveries have increased exponentially so that American families can get what they need from the safety of their homes. We owe a debt of gratitude to the workers who have made this possible by putting themselves into harm's way by working around the clock. The freight industry is also critical to our economy at large and to American competitiveness. Every day, the freight industry moves billions of dollars worth of goods that power numerous industries and businesses. As a result, the freight industry has outsized impact on our economy. Unfortunately, this outsized impact means that problems in the freight industry have ripple effects throughout the entire economy. This subcommittee held a hearing on April 27th where we learned that supplies in the auto industry, many of which are small businesses, are struggling to keep up with the rapidly rising cost of freight and logistics. The issues involved are complex, and they include problems within and beyond the freight industry's control, many of which also stem from the pandemic. But the bottom line is that small businesses are experiencing higher prices and major delays, and these challenges highlight a major issue that I'm certainly committed to addressing, and that's the resiliency of our supply chains. Our supply chains are incredibly efficient, but unfortunately not resilient. So when unexpected happens, like a ship blocking the Suez Canal thousands of miles away, supply chain problems can compound dramatically. And ultimately, the strength of our economy depends on the strength of the freight industry and our supply chains. A key part of this economic engine is the flow of international freight through our country's ports of entry. And as chairman of Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, I'm focused on the safe and secure facilitation of trade and travel at those entry points, which are staffed by our U.S. Customs and Border Protection, also called the CBP. CBP officers and agricultural specialists are critical to ensuring that cargo that enters the U.S. is secure and that pests that may inadvertently travel with that cargo will not hurt our agricultural industry. I have led bipartisan measures to address major staffing shortages for these integral positions, and I will continue to work to ensure that CBP has the adequate resources to fulfill its mission to keep freight moving efficiently through ports of entry. Our competitors, especially China, understand that infrastructure and supply chains are directly linked to economic competitiveness. That's why China is making unprecedented investments in infrastructure and logistics, not only in China, but around the globe as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. Congress must ensure that the United States maintains its global leadership by investing in our infrastructure, in our freight industry, and our workers. The millions of workers employed in the freight industry are the backbone of our economy. We must ensure they have the pay and protections they deserve, along with a safe working environment. Safety is also essential to protect the public at large. Whether we're addressing trucks that share the road with millions of Americans every day, or railroads that move goods through and near our towns, Congress must make safety a top priority. In conclusion, we have a chance to enter a new era of freight mobility that will support countless jobs and families, grow new industries, protect the environment, and improve safety. And I look forward to working with my colleagues on the subcommittee to make that vision a reality. And now I invite Ranking Member Fisher to share her opening remarks.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Chairman Peters, for convening this hearing. First, I would like to take the opportunity to thank those working in the freight transportation industry for their work throughout this pandemic. The truckers, railroaders, longshoremen, and other essential freight transportation workers across this country, they stepped up to deliver the critical supplies we needed to stay safe, healthy, and maintain vital services throughout this very trying year. I'm grateful for all their work and their sacrifice. Today's hearing on freight transportation is timely, given the ongoing discussion about the need to invest in our infrastructure. When we think about what core infrastructure is and what America's core infrastructure needs, we think about the state of our roads and bridges, ports, railroads, waterways, airports, and also broadband. And we have heard time and again about the need to invest in infrastructure, either in hearings before this subcommittee and also the full committee, from reports such as the American Society of Civil Engineers Infrastructure Report Card, and from numerous organizations, including those represented here today. We know that investing in core infrastructure has bipartisan support. Just look at the FAST Act. We passed that in 2015, and the FAA reauthorization in 2018, or the most recent WRDA bills and the pipeline safety reauthorizations. Each of these bills either passed unanimously or with large bipartisan majorities. And Congress has the opportunity to work on infrastructure again in a bipartisan manner as we look toward reauthorizing our federal surface transportation programs set to expire this September. The witnesses here today represent some of the users and operators of that infrastructure, and they have firsthand knowledge of what those needs are. Their testimony today will add to the extensive record that we have about the need for investments in that core infrastructure. Of course, a surface transportation reauthorization not only invests in infrastructure, but it also sets federal policy for the safe and efficient movements of goods across that infrastructure. I look forward to hearing about the wide variety of issues affecting the freight transportation sector that Congress should consider in a surface transportation reauthorization. The first among these issues is how to improve freight transportation safety. There are a number of bipartisan proposals to improve transportation safety, including legislation I've introduced with Chairman Peters to understand the scope and the severity of blocked railroad grade crossings. Advances in technology, targeted policies can make our transportation network safer. Another important topic is how to improve the efficient movement of goods by developing smart policy and removing unnecessary and burdensome regulations. The freight transportation industry is a broad and diverse part of our economy. Federal policies should be based on sound data, and they should recognize the wide variety of operations that are handled on a daily basis across this country. For example, my Bipartisan Hauls Act would provide targeted flexibility for agriculture and livestock haulers to ensure they can move their perishable products. Finally, there has been a widespread reporting of freight congestion at port facilities, cargo delays, and a lack of capacity that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about their work to address these problems and the potential long-term impacts the pandemic will have on the freight industry. Mr. Chairman, I thank you. My apologies. We have a markup and rules committee, so I will have to excuse myself. I hope you excuse me as well. And I will be monitoring the hearing. So thank you very much. Thank you to the panel.
Well, thank you for your opening remarks, Ranking Member Fisher. And I know you're conducting important business, so I know you will be doing that as well, following the developments in this committee. So thank you for your opening statement. We appreciate that. Our first witness today is Mr. Chuck Baker, who is president of the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association. Mr. Baker is here representing approximately 600 short line and regional railroads across the country, many in my home state of Michigan. Mr. Baker has many years of experience working with the rail industry, including as a partner at Chambers, Collin, and Hartwell. Welcome, Mr. Baker, to the subcommittee, and you may proceed with your opening statement.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am Chuck Baker. I'm here representing the nation's 600 short line freight railroads. These railroads operate in 49 states over nearly 50,000 miles of track, or approximately 1/3 of the nation's railroad network. In the states represented by this subcommittee's members, There are 242 short lines operating over 20,000 track miles. Chairman Peters' state of Michigan is one of 10 states where short lines operate more than 70% of the state's rail network. Short lines are most often associated with small town and rural America, but they also serve large urban areas and many of the nation's busiest ports. And they're not always so short. The Rapid City, Pierre, and Eastern Railroad in South Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Wyoming is 743 miles long. Regardless of size or location, there are 4 defining characteristics of today's short lines. 1, most short lines operated track that was previously headed for abandonment. As money-losing branch lines, they received little investment by their previous owners. They were at one time the weakest link in the freight supply chain, but are now a success story, enabling our customers to remain competitive in the global economy. To be successful and rehabilitate this track, short lines invest up to 33% of their annual revenues into their infrastructure, among the highest percent of any industry in the country. 2, for large areas of the country, short line railroad service is the only connection to the national freight rail network, providing an economic lifeline for thousands of businesses, manufacturers, and farmers, and allowing their products to be competitively priced in the global market. 3, flexible, friendly, local service is a key driver of our success. We deal face-to-face on a daily basis with our customers and communities so we can respond quickly to their needs and so they can stay competitive. And 4, short lines are small businesses. Our combined annual revenues across the 600 short lines are less than the annual revenues of any one of the 4 largest Class I railroads. While it's absolutely crucial to enhance the competitiveness of American freight, and that's what short lines are focused on doing every day, it's also crucial to do so in an environmentally sustainable way. As you may have read in my written testimony, which incorporates an excellent environmental report from my friends at the AAR, EPA data shows that rail, which accounts for 40% of US long-distance freight volume, is responsible for just 2.1% of the transportation sector's greenhouse gas emissions. Freight trains can move 1 ton of freight more than 470 miles on 1 gallon of diesel. My testimony highlights a series of examples where moving products by rail, as opposed to on the highways, saves millions of gallons of fuel and thousands of tons of CO2 emissions. In addition to the supply chain and competitiveness benefits of supporting rail and the environmental benefits, there are other public benefits of policies that support rail, such as improved safety, reduced road congestion, and reduced highway maintenance needs. As this committee develops your portion of a surface transportation reauthorization package, we offer a few suggestions that will maximize the benefits that short line railroads can provide to America's supply chain. We strongly support the CRISI grant program, as it is the primary grant program that supports short lines, and it provides for direct short line eligibility. The authorization levels should be significantly increased, and there should be no new commuter rail or large project set-asides that squeeze out short line participation. We support the Infra Grant program and urge you to allow the program to support the most efficient freight projects by removing the $500 million multimodal cap. We know that we are preaching to the choir on this issue, especially with full committee Chairwoman Cantwell, and we thank her for her relentless leadership on the topic. We also support the Cantwell-Blunt Railroad Grade Crossing Elimination Act and Senator Thune and Hassan's RIF reform bill. And we urge you to refrain from any new laws that would undermine the economics of freight railroading and harm our ability to be an important part of America's supply chain, such as increasing truck size and weight limits or mandating railroad crew size laws. In conclusion, we believe short lines are an important link in the freight supply chain, a link we have worked hard to strengthen since we began purchasing these light-density lines decades ago. We understand that in the big picture, our share of infrastructure funding will be limited, but you should not underestimate the power and leverage that that funding provides. That leverage brings 3 advantages. 1, as described in my testimony's Michigan examples, properly targeted public funding helps attract substantially larger amounts of private investment by our customers. 2, for rehabilitation of lines serving our smallest customers, targeted public funding is often the piece needed to justify our own private investment. And 3, for larger projects, public funds can turn multi-year projects into single-year projects. So the economic and environmental benefits you are seeking are realized much sooner. I appreciate the opportunity to present the short line perspective, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Baker, for your testimony. Our second witness today is Mr. Lamont Bird, Director of Safety and Health for the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. In that role, Mr. Byrd oversees the development and the implementation of comprehensive safety and health programs for the 1.4 million member international union. Mr. Byrd also serves as chairman of the Motor Carrier Safety Advisory Committee at the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. Welcome, Mr. Byrd. You may proceed with your opening comments.
Thank you. Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Fisher, and members of the subcommittee, my name again is Lamont Byrd. I'm the Director of Safety and Health for the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Thank you for inviting me here today to testify about freight mobility, strengthening America's supply chains and competitiveness. The Teamsters Union represents more than 600,000 commercial truck drivers, and through the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Ways employees, we also represent more than 70,000 rail employees. Our members in these industry sectors have seen their work demands increase dramatically over the past several years, and even during the COVID-19 pandemic, as many are classified as essential workers. In this opening statement, I will discuss infrastructure, globalization and cross-border operations, truck and rail safety regulations, and related operational policies. But many additional issues are discussed in our written testimony, and please feel free to ask me any questions you may have on those topics as well. I'd like to begin with infrastructure. The failure to invest and improve the nation's infrastructure has adversely impacted trucking and rail employers, workers, and consumers. The explosion of online shopping, coupled with consumer demands, has placed more freight in the system and more pressure on both truck drivers and railroaders to deliver goods quickly. Structural changes across both industries, such as the use of precision scheduled railroading by some carriers, has added to this enormous strain. Our hope is that this administration can partner with Congress to move forward on rebuilding America's infrastructure while simultaneously addressing serious operational concerns being raised by workers. Globalization and international trade agreements have also increased new challenges for American workers, including those in transportation. The renegotiation of NAFTA enabled the Teamsters Union to work with the U.S. Trade Representative to require foreign trucks and drivers that deliver goods into the U.S. to comply with all motor carrier and driver safety laws, allowing us an opportunity to establish a framework to protect safe, good-paying American trucking jobs. That was a good result, but much work remains to be done. We must ensure that carriers are prevented from bringing foreign drivers into the United States under temporary business visas and violating cabotage laws. We must also address similar cross-border issues in the rail industry where serious problems have arisen at the southern border. The Teamsters Union continues to be concerned about the numerous exemptions to the hours of service regulations that are granted to motor carriers by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration and legislated by Congress. We are specifically concerned about FMCSA's changes to the short haul provision for CDL qualified drivers, the revision to the definition of rest break, which allows all non-driving work to be considered as rest, and the issuance of two pilot programs, one allowing under 21-year-old drivers to transport goods in interstate commerce, and the other permitting CMV drivers to pause their workday up to 3 hours. None of these regulatory revisions or pilot programs improve safety, and they should all be repealed. One of these pilot programs, which would allow under 21-year-olds to operate in interstate commerce, is apparently being driven by the challenges employers face in recruiting and hiring qualified drivers. While long work hours, difficult work, and the need for clean driving and drug and alcohol testing records create hiring challenges for motor carriers, we do not believe that the solution to these challenges is to hire more foreign drivers or lower the minimum driving age. Pay and working conditions need to be improved so that drivers who are already in the industry are incentivized to stay. Part of incentivizing drivers to stay also includes taking a science-based approach to drug testing. The Department of Health and Human Services issued guidelines for hair testing for federally mandated drug testing programs late last year. The Teamsters oppose this method of testing as there are significant unresolved scientific issues associated with hair testing. Finally, autonomous vehicles have the potential to reshape the entire transportation sector, including the trucking and rail industries. While some of this technology has the potential to improve truck safety and efficiency, the threat of self-driving trucks replacing or degrading millions of truck driver jobs is of great concern to our members. We need Congress to ensure that before we move forward with automation, that proper protections are in place. Many of those safety protections may be needed for thousands of vehicles that are already on the roads. That is why we support a study on the use of commercial vehicles with a gross vehicle weight rating of less than 10,000 pounds in package delivery operations as required in Section 4104 of H.R. 2. There is very little data, if any, relating to the safety performance, and these same size vehicles are also likely to be used in autonomous operations. So a detailed review of their operational safety is critical to our members. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Byrd. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you for being here today. Our third witness today is Mr. Chris Connor, the President and CEO of the American Association of Port Authorities, also known as AAPA. The AAPA represents more than 130 public port authorities in the U.S., Canada, the Caribbean, and Latin America. Mr. Connor has a wealth of experience, having spent over 35 years in the ocean shipping industry before leading AAPA. Welcome, Mr. Connor. You may proceed with your opening comments.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Fisher, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Chris Connor, President and CEO of the American Association of Port Authorities. I would like to thank this subcommittee, as well as the full committee, for holding this hearing, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss maritime and trade infrastructure and the related investment needs on behalf of public port authorities throughout the U.S. and its territories. Our nation's seaports deliver vital goods to consumers, facilitate the export of American-made goods, create jobs, and support local and national economic growth. Ports also play a crucial role in our national defense, witnessed by the designation of 17 of our nation's ports as strategic seaports by the DoD. Prior to the outbreak of COVID-19, the total economic value generated in terms of revenue to businesses, personal income, and economic output by U.S. deep draft ports accounted for $5.4 trillion annually, or roughly 26% of GDP. Research also shows that nearly 31 million Americans were employed in jobs generated as a result of port activity. AAPA is mindful of and grateful for this committee's positive efforts on the passage of MITSERA, as well as for the increased authorization levels for PIDP. It is imperative, however, as this committee considers reauthorization of our nation's surface transportation policies, that we develop and fund a robust national freight strategy to remain competitive in the global economy. The FAST Act made significant strides in this regard through the creation of the Discretionary Infra Grant Program and the formula-based National Highway Freight Program. These existing freight programs are primarily highway focused, and while highways are essential to our freight network, ports are multimodal facilitators connecting trains, trucks, and ships, all of which need access to ports. As we look to build off the progress made under the FAST Act, it's critical that the following be considered. All freight program funding should be made 100% multimodal. Secondly, lift the 10% state caps for build grants. Thirdly, continue freight planning through state freight plans and a national freight strategic plan. And finally, establish an Office of Freight and Multimodal Infrastructure policy. We also have an opportunity to lower carbon emissions and improve air quality at near-port communities and reduce congestion on highways. Let's eliminate the double HMT taxation and incentivize increased use of marine highways, the cleanest, safest, and most efficient form of transport in the U.S. Ports across the country were pleased to see dedicated funding proposed in the President's America's Jobs Plan, as well as in the Republican roadmap. It's a great start and an encouraging development. Investments such as those outlined in both plans will be critical to ensuring that the U.S. has a 21st century multimodal freight network to compete globally and deliver locally. To support our nation's deep draft ports and maritime industry, AAPA recommends the following be included in any large-scale infrastructure package. $20 billion for deep draft port infrastructure and intermodal freight movement connectors. Robust funding for electrification of dockside ship connections and zero or near zero emission port equipment. $6 billion for the U.S. Army Corps' Coastal Navigation Program, and $500 million for port development of offshore wind energy in order to catalyze it at scale. And finally, I want to bring to light something that our ports aren't able to say themselves. Ports are being held hostage by CBP to pay for extravagant facility upgrades and officer staffing shortfalls. The brave men and women at CBP need and deserve a dedicated facilities fund. I know that Chairman Peters is aware of this issue, and we thank him for his interest and support. Once again, I appreciate the opportunity to share with the subcommittee our thoughts regarding freight mobility, and I hope you will consider the steps outlined here that Congress can take to help ports and our nation's trade infrastructure remain strong. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Connor, for your testimony and your presence here today. Our last witness is Mr. Chris Spear, who serves as president and CEO of the American Trucking Associations, also known as ATA. ATA represents every sector of the trucking industry across all 50 states. Prior to joining ATA, Mr. Spear worked in the private sector and also served in the federal government. His career spanned working in the transportation, energy, labor, and technology sectors across 5 continents. Most recently, Chris worked for Hyundai Motor Company, where he served as vice president for governmental affairs. Welcome, Mr. Spear. You may proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Fisher and members of the subcommittee. On behalf of the more than 34,000 members of the American Trucking Associations, thank you for the opportunity to testify. ATA is an 87-year-old federation of 50 state trucking associations and the largest, most diverse national trade association representing the trucking industry. Trucking now employs 7.8 million Americans in every state and congressional district, including 3.6 million truck drivers. That's 1 in 16 jobs in the United States, where the top job in 29 states is a truck driver. And despite commercial vehicles being only 4% of the vehicles on our nation's highways, the trucking industry moves more than 71% of the nation's freight tonnage and pays nearly half of the tab into the Highway Trust Fund. Today, more than 80% of U.S. communities rely exclusively on trucks for their freight transportation needs. Coming into the global pandemic, trucks moved $10.4 trillion worth of goods annually, more than half of U.S. gross domestic product. And despite a chronic and growing shortage of drivers, our industry and our intermodal partners here today are the glue that kept this economy together these past 14 months. Despite near biblical accounts of empty store shelves, we never ran out of milk, eggs, toilet paper, or even fuel. There was plenty in the supply chain and always a hard-working, patriotic driver to make sure that those shelves got restocked. America's supply chain yields tremendous potential. It's a catalyst for economic growth beyond that of any other nation. For that to happen, however, I ask that this committee consider 4 key elements that both feed and benefit our nation's supply chain: infrastructure, safety, workforce development, and environmental stewardship. These elements together shape and define the resiliency of our supply chain. Those of us testifying here today have no problem identifying issues of difference, but there is no argument between any of us that our dependency on one another is what allows our supply chain to withstand the pressures of a global pandemic. In fact, no pandemic, hurricane, flood, fire, no tariff, no tweet, or senseless partisan bickering is going to keep our industry from doing its job. But we are here today to ask that you do yours. Investments in our supply chain are desperately needed, including the roads and bridges that connect our ports, rail yards, airports to the national highway system. Do that, and you will witness measurable efficiencies, including gains in productivity and safety, job growth and sustainable employment, and historic reductions in carbon emissions. Infrastructure is not partisan, and if anyone in Congress believes that roads and bridges are political, you haven't been driving on them. But they are in desperate need of your leadership and support. In just the last year, Congress spent $6 trillion in response to the pandemic, of which $4 trillion was passed with bipartisan support. Reasons aside, this was an unprecedented level of spending our country has never witnessed, not ever. And not 1 cent of it was paid for. Yet, according to the Congressional Budget Office, the Federal Highway Trust Fund will be bankrupt, flat broke, next summer. The good news for Congress is that it can and should be paid for by users, all of them, including truckers. However you craft legislation, please consider the written testimony provided to you today and understand that if these investments are indeed made, you have an opportunity to go home before your constituents and point and say, that road, that bridge, that railroad, port, waterway, airport, I did that. I made that happen. In other words, stop blaming each other for the things you don't do and start taking credit for the things you should do. These investments are long overdue. They are the things Americans, your constituents, need, use, and rely on every single day. They'll be grateful. And I guarantee you that the nearly 8 million people that make up the trucking industry will be too. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Spear. Thank you for your opening statement. We have a day with a lot going on. Members are going back and forth, a number of markups, and so I'm going to defer my questions as members are here. Senator Blumenthal, you are recognized for your 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Baker, I am very, very focused on freight because I agree that it is really critical to our future, even in a small state like Connecticut. As you may know, we have ports in New London, Bridgeport, and New Haven. Each of them is connected by rail lines, although most people in Connecticut really aren't aware of it. The rail in eastern Connecticut is being revived so that it can carry freight from New London up through Connecticut to Massachusetts. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about how we can raise awareness about the potential for freight, not only in the Congress, but in the country.
Thank you for the question, Senator. One of the ways I think to raise awareness, and I associate myself with the comments that Mr. Spear made and both Senator Peters and Senator Fisher made in their opening statements, is recognizing the incredible role that freight transportation and freight workers played over the last 14 months, helping our country survive a sort of a once in a century disruption. You know, in general, in the freight world, we're used to not being particularly high profile. There's, of course, this famous political saying, freight, don't vote. And you know, that's okay. We don't necessarily need to be in the limelight, but I do think with the surface transportation bill pending in front of you, there's a historic opportunity on the freight rail side. The CRISI grant program is a huge opportunity to support those kind of investments. Then we'd also point to the infra grant program and the ability to make that more multimodal. I think with those sort of investments that and the success will garner attention.
Thank you. Mr. Byrd, in many of the fatal truck crashes, as you know, and there seem to be quite a few of them, truck driver fatigue is often a factor, in fact, a leading factor. What recommendations do you have to prevent truck driver fatigue causing these kinds of accidents?
Thank you for your question, Senator. I think you've raised a very important point in terms of the contribution that fatigue makes toward unsafe driving and contributes toward truck crashes. I think that if we really need to revisit the hours of service regulation. These drivers are working in excess of 60 hours a week. More often than not, they're working 14 hours a day, and they're constantly there's constant pressure on changing these regulations to further relax them or weaken them. I think we really need to revisit the hours of service regulation, and we need to look at this from the perspective of the impact that it makes on driver health and the ability to get restorative rest. So I think a first step is just revisiting the hours of service regulation, because they allow just too many hours for drivers to work each week.
Mr. Spear, do you agree?
I certainly agree, Senator, that it is a problem. We acknowledge it. I also agree with Lamont on hours of service. We're not out there pounding pavement for hours of service suspension. Those suspensions have to be a really high bar. We have a driver shortage. You're well aware of that. And to have a suspension of hours of service and work our existing drivers even harder is going to exacerbate that problem that you just described. But I'm also remiss that you also have to look at the overall fatalities involving trucks. And DOT data shows that 2/3 of the accidents, fatal accidents involving trucks, are actually caused by passenger vehicles. And the two leading causes are speeding and texting. So as we look at this panoramically, you got to deal with tired drivers. You got to deal with keeping the hours in check. ELDs, electronic logging devices. We certainly advocated that, and I think it's having measurable benefits since we put that technology in place to making certain that we are staying with the hours. And we have a long way to go in terms of really bringing the overall fatalities down. We share that goal. We'll certainly work with you and members of the Senate to make certain that that happens.
Thanks very much. Thanks to the whole panel for your testimony today. My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Baldwin, you are recognized for your questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. In Wisconsin, we make things, and in this discussion about stronger supply chains, we need to ensure that we have a stronger workforce to transport our goods to market. Women currently make up less than 10% of the truck driving workforce, and removing barriers that get in the way of women pursuing, retaining, and advancing in careers in trucking is key. Those are jobs as drivers and freight firm owners. Senator Moran and I have introduced a bipartisan bill, also supported by Senators Tester and Fisher, which would support women in the trucking industry and establish a Women in Trucking Advisory Board. And I'll be working to include that bill in our surface transportation reauthorization. Mr. Spear, thank you for your support of that legislation. Could you share a little bit more about how we need to break down these barriers for women in trucking and how that would improve the strength of our supply chains and competitiveness in the United States?
Absolutely, Senator, and thank you for your leadership and sponsoring that bill. ATA is a supporter of it, and we do need to acknowledge the shortfalls in our workforce. Bringing more minorities and women into it is certainly a challenge, and you just can't talk about it. You got to do something about it. You're introducing this bill as a significant step forward. We internally at ATA have set up diversity workforces to define policies and create platforms that we can help you all advocate to make it attractive to people out there that may not know about our industry and to bring them in. We have a 7% participation rate for women in our driver workforce. That is way too low. And we need to take steps to really highlight why that's a good profession for anyone interested in being in our industry. It's good pay, pays in the mid-50s on average with full benefits. It is a very, very supportive environment with a lot of diversity and options for anyone to choose from to earn a good salary and living. For women, we've got to make it safer for them out there on the road. It's a bit intimidating when you're doing long haul as a woman and going to truck stops at night. Many don't feel safe to get out on their own. We have to work with our partners, our members in the truck stop sector of our industry to make certain that they feel just as welcome as anyone else that moves freight. And we have also gone to great lengths, Senator, to really highlight the champions in our industry, including women, by putting them on our America's Road team. We've had them at the White House. We've had them on panels. We've had them meet with members of Congress and really showcasing that women are very much a part of this industry, but we need to do more. And with your leadership and support of this legislation, I believe we're on the right path.
Well, thank you. Mr. Connor, like you, I am incredibly supportive of the Port Infrastructure Development Grant Program, both as a member of this committee and on the Appropriations Committee. I was so pleased to hear that the Port of Milwaukee was a recipient of the first round of grant funding, and that ports across the Great Lakes are competing well for these funds. I'd like to have you share a little bit more about how these grants are being put to work to make us more competitive, and including how they can help ensure our port infrastructure is more resilient to varying and higher lake levels in the Great Lakes.
Senator Baldwin, thanks for that question. I just want to make one quick anecdotal comment to your previous question to Chris. I'm just proud to inform you that amongst the 80 U.S. port members that AAPA has, 14% of the CEOs of those ports are women, which is about double the average of the Fortune 500 companies. So I think that's interesting in a rough and tumble business, as ports may be perceived to be, that we have such a strong representation of female CEOs. To your question, yeah, I was delighted to see about Port Milwaukee getting that grant. That program is, one of a kind. It's the only program, for ports only. It is amazingly oversubscribed each time. So we're in our third cycle, I believe now, and the grant requests exceed about $1 billion, where the grant authorization has been somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 to 300, depending on the year. It's trended up in the last couple of years, so we're encouraged by that. But these are important dollars to allow ports to improve their infrastructure, to prepare for the challenges that you're now seeing played out in front of us in real time by the volume surges and the long-term resiliency challenges that we have from not only sea level rise, but weather events, earthquakes, fires, or any kind of major accident. So these are important dollars, but I have to say, Senator, but they fall short of what's needed.
Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. Senator Scott, you're recognized for your questions.
I want to thank Chairman Peters and Ranking Member Fisher for holding this important meeting. I want to thank you all the witnesses for being here today. So I became governor of Florida back in January of 2011, and we were in a big downturn in our economy, but we figured out how to invest in our ports, airports, or seaports and airports. We invested $85 billion over 8 years, and we did it without raising any taxes. I understand there's a labor shortage for commercial truck drivers. My dad was a truck driver. He drove for Navajo Freight Lines. This shortage directly impacts the supply chain of goods and causes delays for the manufacturers, consumers, and corporations across the U.S. And as you all know, we're seeing significant inflation right now. I've heard from our state's ag community. They've been hit hard by COVID-19 and many unfair trade practices, and they're struggling on top of that. to find drivers to transport their crops. I watched my dad be gone a lot. He was an over-road truck driver, and he's gone a lot, and it's a tough job. I recently co-sponsored the Drive Safe Act with my colleagues Senator Young and Senator Tester, which would allow 18 to 21-year-olds to drive trucks safely across state lines once they have completed an apprenticeship, enhanced safety training, and job opportunities for young truckers. Mr. Spear, Mr. Connor, do you believe allowing 18 to 21-year-olds to drive nationally will help the commercial truck driving labor shortage we see today, and do you think it makes sense?
I do, Senator, and thanks for the question. I think it's one of several things we need to be doing. It won't on its own do everything we need to shore up the shortage, but it is a significant step. We need access to the younger talent pool. And just let me quickly just point out that the folks that oppose this legislation need to understand that 49 states and the District of Columbia right now allow an 18-year-old to drive a Class 8. You just can't cross state lines. So you can go from Texarkana, Texas to El Paso and back, but you just can't cross into Texarkana, Arkansas. That makes no sense. But what makes really no sense is the fact that these 49 states in the district have no training standards or technology attached to it. The bill that you're sponsoring has got 400 hours of training, of which 240 you have to have an experienced driver in the cab. You also have collision and mitigation systems, AEB, speed limiters, cameras attached to the equipment. This is a step toward safety, much better than what you have in 49 states in the district, not away. And if we can entrust an 18-year-old, my son included, who commissions as a second lieutenant next Saturday, into the Army to go serve and protect our freedom, if we can train him to do that on our behalf, I'm quite confident that we can train him to cross state lines in a Class 8.
First off, for Senator Peters and me, thank you very much for your son's service. This committee is very supportive of our military, and so thanks for doing that. I guess it was a hard year to get in the Navy. Is that what it was? I was in the Navy.
It wasn't the Air Force, I can assure you.
So, Mr. Connor?
Senator, thanks for the question. I would just simply say that AAPA and its members would be fully supportive and would strongly encourage Congress to pass legislation which improves the cargo fluidity across our nation and strengthens our freight network.
Yeah, I mean, it probably, you know, if you think about it, for a small state, it's a bigger deal. But Florida is still it's important for us in places like Texas, but boy, for smaller states, it's probably even a bigger deal. I guess for everybody, I was a big supporter of our ports. We invested, in my 8 years, we invested $1.4 billion in our ports. We have 15 seaports in Florida. We're the closest ports on the East Coast to the Panama Canal. So it was a big opportunity, and we actually created a lot of jobs. As you all know, the Panama Canal now accommodates the new Panamax vessels, and it's clearly changing shipping patterns. Our goal was to get all the shipping that goes to the West Coast to come to Florida, if it can. So what do you all think Congress should be doing to ensure that all of our ports have the opportunity to deal with these Panamax ships? Probably not somebody in the Great Lakes, but clearly along our east and west coast.
Well, I'm sure that Chris Connor with the AAPA will have a lengthy answer to this also, but I would add, from a rail point of view, one of the places that we are very much in agreement with ports, in addition to supporting the Port Infrastructure Development Grant Program, which was just discussed, we'd also point to the infra grant program and recommend to Congress removing the multimodal cap on that to allow the applicants to choose to invest wherever they think is most beneficial. And oftentimes those are port projects or perhaps rail access to port projects, which would be a 2-for-1 for Chris and I. And I would point to both of those as attractive options.
Yeah, it's the rail connection is pretty important to us, and how fast. What I learned in the ports, I'm not an expert on the ports, but what I learned in the ports is how fast the things got off those ships and got into the rail was a big deal, especially as it came up the East Coast. And so if the Port of Miami could do better than Brunswick, it really created a lot of jobs in Florida.
Yes, sir. It's a very, the freight network is extraordinarily interconnected, and we rely on trucks and rely on ports, and we all work together, but it's also extraordinarily competitive. And, competition is an incredible motivator for for folks, and ports competing with each other and competing with coasts, and rails competing with each other and rails competing with trucks tends to have beneficial results.
You know, I don't know if it's happened in all the states, but in my years as governor, there were so many companies that showed up that just created logistics. They were just logistics companies that were trying, I don't know if Senator Peters, did that happen in your state, but you have all these people that all they did was create logistics all day long. And everybody was bidding to figure out the cheapest way of doing things. And so if we can, one of my experiences, if we can invest in our ports and our airports and our roads, it really does create a lot of jobs. So, anybody else? Thanks.
Just a quick note, Senator, on the freight intermodal connectors. These are the roads to ports, rail yards, and airports. We're looking at that data. 19% of that is mediocre condition. 37% of that is in very poor condition. And we really started to understand when ports invest, they dredge, they modernize technology, and so on. All that money getting poured in. I remember touring the New York, New Jersey Port Authority about 3 years ago after they poured several hundred million into their port. And when you look at the heat map around that, and freight was still red. It was all bottlenecked around the port because these intermodal connectors weren't invested. And we looked into that, and 70% of those roads, that is intermodal road connectors, are under the jurisdiction of local and county governments. So the federal and the state role in that there's a huge separation there that has to be addressed, because no matter how much money you pour into the ports, if the boxes are still sitting there and we can't get out of the port area, a lot of good that did you. So I think the coordination when you look at legislation to make certain that we're pulling those counties and local governments in and make sure they get the money, I think you're going to see more efficiency there.
So I'll tell you a cute story. Just be off a little bit. We put up all the money for the to go underneath the port, so the trucks could get out straight from the port up to 90. I guess it was 95 in Miami, and the feds came down, put up no money, and we had to wait for them to start the event. And they were on time for the other one, but we also did the same thing in Tampa. We made it easier to get from the port of Tampa onto I guess 75 in whatever the road is on the bypass. Over towards I-4. It really made a big difference. And then when we were doing the announcement, the first truck that was supposed to come through somehow got delayed. So for like 15 minutes, we're all just waiting there. But it really paid off. What you just brought up, it really paid off for the Port of Miami and the Port of Tampa. So, but you're right. We all have to work together, and every part of it really matters. So, although my dad didn't like anything going on rail when I was growing up.
Senator, if I could add one final comment to your question about the larger ships coming through the canal. Of the $6 billion that I mentioned earlier in my oral, and it's in the written as well, $3 billion of that would be specifically for completion funding of 12 federal navigation channel improvement projects that are currently underway or awaiting initial funding. So we certainly recognize the advent of the larger canal and the deeper draft ships that come with that, and encourage Congress to include that spending in any infrastructure package. Thank you.
It's a lot of good paying. By the way, those are really, the people around the ports make a lot of money. It's really good paying jobs. It's really nice. So thanks, everybody.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Senator Scott, for your question. Senator Lummis, you are recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And one of the fun things about this job is you get to hear about all of the different states and the issues they deal with. I come from the very large landlocked state of Wyoming, through which Interstate 80 passes, which I think is now the major corridor for truck traffic that's going coast to coast. So we see a lot of trucks. I farm on one side of the state and ranch on the other side, and I take I-80 all the time, and there are so many trucks, it's just unbelievable. My question for Mr. Spear, because of the hours of service regulations, there's a lack of dedicated truck parking, and I see it. I see it with my own eyes on Interstate 80. How large is the gap between the number of trucks we have on the road and the amount of parking made available to them?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. And we have legislation now introduced up here on the Hill that would channel monies to the Highway Trust, from the Highway Trust Fund into truck parking, $755 million of it through the Truck Parking Safety Improvement Act. And it is a huge problem. You don't have to go far from this dais. You can go just up way here and get on 95 to Baltimore, and you're going to see multiple trucks parked on the shoulders, on the on and off ramps, and it's a hazard, but they have to comply with their rest breaks. And without parking to do that, they're putting the motoring public at risk. And this has become a national problem. So you don't have to go far from here to see it. It exists in Wyoming. I always call Wyoming, my home state, the high, land of high altitude and low multitude. But there are a lot of trucks and there isn't a lot of parking. And it becomes a problem when that intermixes in states as sparse as Wyoming with motoring traffic, passenger vehicles. So it definitely needs to be part of any legislation that you consider. This component really is key, and our entire industry is very much behind it. So really appreciate you drawing attention to it, Senator.
Yeah, thank you for that. And in addition to that, there's some traffic bottlenecks in my neighborhood. The American Transportation Research Institute identifies each year the top 100 freight bottlenecks in the country. 3 of them are in my neighboring state of Colorado, and trucks can sit for hours on the way to Wyoming, and so that drives up prices and sometimes delays business for people in my state. So do these large bottlenecks require attention from Congress as well? And how much economic input or output is lost from these larger bottlenecks?
They are considerable. We put that report out every year. I'm on the board of ATRI, and I think that data is extremely useful for members of Congress to see their states, their districts, and where these bottlenecks exist. We track it through GPS data, and it is really an outstanding report, real time. I have to give a shout out to Senator Blumenthal. He has 7 of them in the state of Connecticut. Small state of Connecticut has 7 of the top 100. And so I applaud him for being here. He has a vested stake in this. Colorado, as you said, Senator, has 3. We've shared that with your staffs. That report is very, very helpful in showing the impact that congestion and the lack of investment of infrastructure is having. 425,000 drivers sit idle every year for an entire year, sitting in those top 100 bottlenecks. That's $75 billion to the annual cost of freight transportation each year. And for anyone that's cared about the environment, that's 67.3 million metric tons of CO2 being emitted just sitting in traffic. If we can just deal with those top 100 bottlenecks and those intermodal freight connectors I spoke about earlier, you'd see so many efficiencies, so many improvements in productivity, safety, environment. If you're a driver and you're sitting in traffic, we already have a driver shortage, you got a lot of time on your hands to think about, hey, I could probably be doing something else. And so congestion is very impactful, and not just to mention, as the senator rightfully did, the impact on the prices we pay for goods. So making that a key component of any legislation would draw a lot of support from ATA.
Well, thank you. We've all seen a dramatic increase in e-commerce and the need for logistics and deliveries of all of this e-commerce, and I don't see that changing just because COVID is starting to lift. So thank you for your testimony today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Senator Lummis, for your questions. Senator Warnock, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for your testimony today. Georgia is known for its freight transportation and logistics prowess due to an extensive infrastructure network. We have one of the busiest airports in the world, but we also have the 3rd top container port with the most extensive rail terminal facility in the country. We have nearly 4,700 freight rail miles operated by nearly 30 railroads. We also have 6 interstates, 1,200 highway that cover 1,200 highway miles. This allows our state to serve as a freight hub for the entire Southeast. Mr. Baker and Mr. Connor, could you speak to the importance of investing in multimodal freight infrastructure, not just highways, and to ensure that all of our freight transportation systems are able to interact and connect efficiently? Why is that important?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Senator, for the question. As we've discussed a little bit already today, freight is very much an integrated network, and rail works closely with our friends in port, our friends in the trucking industry. They're our competitors, but they're also all part of an integrated network. But we would very much agree with the premise of your question that investment in rail and ports is crucial. I've suggested a few ways that Congress could help that. Our Class 1 railroad friends do the investment on their own. They're privately owned and funded, and they largely just need policies to not harm their ability to do that. On the short line side, and as you've noted, there are dozens of short line railroads in Georgia, many smaller businesses in rural areas. We agree with our friends at the Class 1s, and we do ask Congress for a little bit of help on the grant funding side. We think there are huge benefits to doing that for the Georgia economy, for rural Georgia, and for the environment also. So I'd point to, in particular, the CRISI grant program and the infra grant program as 2 areas that we would love your support on.
Got it. So it seems, given what you've said, and you spoke to this, much of this earlier in our hearing today, it would suggest that we can't simply rely on one mode over another. That part of the reason Georgia has been successful at attracting manufacturing and logistics businesses is we have diversified our transportation network. What more can we do here in Congress to ensure that we're making smart investments that will improve safety and efficiency while reducing congestion and harmful emissions?
Well, Senator, thank you for the question. This is Chris Connor from AAPA. One of the things that we are strongly advocating in the reauthorization of the FAST Act is the creation of within DOT, an Office of Multimodal Freight Transportation, so that DOT has the ability to better leverage all modes. As my colleagues on the panel, I think, have nailed it each time, it is a connected network. Regrettably, we haven't always looked at it that way. It hasn't been invested in that way. But I think a much more high-level strategic approach, which was originally outlined in the 2015 passage of the Freight Act, if we could take the quality of that national freight strategy up a few floors higher, I think we could really start to look upon our country as a system of connected networks that includes ships, trucks, trains, and short sea transport, not only along our coast, but in our navigational inland routes to deliver goods and services to our citizens.
So it's all of the above, and this is work that can't be efficient and at the same time operate in silos. We have to see it in an integrated manner that does not place kind of arbitrary caps on intermodal infrastructure. That is really an integrated approach. So thank you so much, and I look forward to working with you to make sure that that's the kind of vision that we put forward, certainly for the state of Georgia, but for our country at large.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Warnock, for your questions. Mr. Byrd, my first question is for you. Mr. Byrd, I'm someone who supports technological innovation. If we're able to make workplaces safer, if we create new jobs in the process, I think there's just tremendous opportunity there. But I would also agree with the statements that you made in your opening testimony that we have to tread carefully with the rise of automation, which is happening now and will continue to happen in the future. I would categorize automation as perhaps one of our biggest opportunities as well as one of our biggest challenges for our country and the world in this next century. And we certainly have our work cut out to ensure that technology continues to be a force for good and that everybody benefits from technological advances and innovation, not just a few. And that probably really depends on enacting the right policies today. You can't wait, particularly as technology is moving as rapidly as it is now. We have to have those policies today so that these advances have real benefits for workers and for the American middle class, not in the future, but now. So my question for you, Mr. Byrd, is when it comes to the freight industry, if we can harness technology in ways that vastly improve safety, also expand job opportunities, if we can do that to help our country, is that something that we should be striving for? And would you support that type of innovation within our country?
Thank you very much for your question, Senator. Yes, we could support that type of innovation, but we have to make sure that, as you indicated, on the front side, we have to make the necessary investment to ensure that there's regulatory authority established, and we understand which agency or agencies are going to have that regulatory authority. We have to keep in mind what has to be done for the training of the workforce to ensure that they can adequately operate the new vehicles or be retrained to provide maintenance or other support functions for those automated vehicles. So I think if we take a step back and take a comprehensive look at all of the elements that are necessary to move forward, I think we could do this in a way that would not be necessarily harmful to the existing workforce, and it could help move forward in terms of us being able to innovate as a country.
Well, that's good to hear, and we probably have to do it simultaneously. You mentioned stepping back, but technology is moving rapidly. From a competitive standpoint, we're facing international pressures from significant competitors. The Chinese are investing billions of dollars into this technology. Europeans, that if we do it simultaneously, and we're thinking about both equally, that sounds like something you would support and your organization would support.
Yes, and I also think that it's important that we understand as a country what companies are moving forward with the innovation. Where is this happening? We need to have information about the challenges that these companies have encountered in terms of implementing these types of technologies, the type of malfunctions, the other types of problems that they may have encountered. And then we need to get input from the workforce that's actually interacting with this technology to get their input to understand how this is having an impact on workers also.
Great, thank you. Mr. Baker, in 2017, a notorious railroad crossing in Plymouth, Michigan was blocked for 9 hours. Unfortunately, blocked railroad crossings are not something unique to Plymouth. That's a problem that happens in towns all across my state, all across the country, as you're fully aware. Unnecessary delays hurt local businesses, making it harder for them to operate, and hurts families trying to get their kids to school and to activities. Makes it difficult for them to get to and from work. And worst of all, it can be an enormous public safety problem. Blocked railroad crossings can prevent first responders from attending to life or death situations and many other safety concerns. And that's why I'm currently working with Ranking Member Fisher to address this problem. Chair Cantwell and Senator Blunt are also working on this issue with legislation that they put forward. So my question to you, Mr. Baker, is do you support my efforts and Senator Fisher's efforts and the efforts of many other members of this committee to address delays at rail crossings to improve safety at these crossings? And could you comment on how your members are addressing this incredibly important issue?
Yes, sir. I'll try to answer each of those questions. On the addressing it first, the short line railroads are extraordinarily committed to addressing those individually in real time with communities. Frankly, it's probably a little bit easier for short lines than some of my Class 1 friends, given that we typically have smaller track and or shorter track and simpler networks to manage, and we generally can address those problems, and we work very hard to mitigate any of those impacts before you would ever hear about them. However, there obviously are still challenges, and we're not perfect, and sometimes they're unavoidable. We're very supportive of Senator Cantwell and Blunt's proposal to fund grade crossing elimination, and we've endorsed that publicly, and we think that in times where we can't solve the problem operationally, throwing some money at the problem, frankly, to help separate the crossings would address the issue. And with the Fisher, Tester, Moran, Klobuchar, Peters bill S-700, I believe we've said publicly we don't oppose the bill. Frankly, I would say we find it a much more thoughtful approach than your friends in the House took in H.R. 2 last year, and if that bill finds its way into surface transportation authorization, we do think that it would be beneficial to gather some of that data, and it would be a useful, productive step.
Great, good to hear that. Mr. Spear, just to follow up to that, I mentioned some of the challenges when you have railroad crossings blocked, but certainly that means problems for the trucking industry as well. Could you just briefly tell the committee what would happen when you have Plymouth, for example, with a 9-hour delay, what that could mean for the freight industry, for your industry? What sort of challenges does that present, and why do we need to fix this problem?
Yeah, I think it really underscores the intermodal, nature of our supply chain now, and it has repercussions. It certainly backs up the movement of freight. We've seen it there. We've seen it in, blockage of the Suez Canal, as was mentioned earlier. These things are very measurable. We have to look at each one individually, as they're all a little bit different. This latest cyber attack of the Colonial Pipeline, certainly something that we are working hand in glove with DOT to ensure that, not only is it back up, but we get that fuel to where it needs to go. We don't want long lines. We want to make certain we maintain supply. But when you talk about resiliency, it's these instances, they have a compounding effect on our ability to get freight on time. It not only delays, but it escalates what we pay. And it's also an issue of safety, particularly when you have hours of service suspensions and working that, already depleted workforce harder. So these are all things that you have to look at panoramically and really understand the complexity of supply chain. How resilient really is it? One of these instances we're pretty darn good at managing, even a natural disaster to a global pandemic. But when you compound all those at the same time, there's a break point. And that's what I think the next bill really needs to look at is, in totality, the whole supply chain, and equip government with its private sector partners in a way that we can manage those instances effectively. So you're spot on right in looking at these problems, because added up, they're going to be a real significant impact on the economy.
Yeah, absolutely, Mr. Spear. Thank you for that answer. Senator Thune, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all the witnesses for being here today to discuss the importance of a robust, fluid, and interconnected freight transportation system. It is crucial that freight policy continue to recognize the importance of rural areas where the vast majority of agricultural and industrial commodities originate. While they may not be located in major cities or experience high traffic volumes, rural freight corridors are a crucial component of the nation's transportation system, ensuring goods are transported around the nation and the world safely and efficiently. Mr. Connor, record container volumes at our nation's ports have exacerbated port congestion and highlighted the need for investments that alleviate congestion throughout the nation's freight transportation system, including ports. This is especially true as we look forward to a strong recovery from the pandemic. The container shortage has harmed a wide swath of shippers, but exporters of agricultural commodities whose container turnaround times are often longer have been hit especially hard. With more than 20% of agricultural production exported in the United States, our producers depend on access to foreign markets. Could you describe any actions that port authorities are taking to alleviate the harmful effects of the container shortage, I should say?
Senator, thanks for that question. Let me respond this way. There was a report that dropped on Friday by the World Bank and IHS Markit that was headlined, "American Ports Fail to Make the Grade on Efficiency." And it was a report on the Container Port Performance Index from 2020 called the CPPI. And they ranked the 351 of the world's largest container ports on dwell time, which is a measure that's largely seen as a reflection of how ports have processes and their infrastructure. The top ranked US port in that study was ranked number 53. The second ranked US port was ranked number 87. Not surprisingly, Asian ports led the way. So, you know, we're getting beat on infrastructure spending, particularly by China. I would highlight anecdotally that AAPA is in the early stages of a white paper that we're writing called Staying a Superpower. And in the early analysis that we've done, when it comes to public spending on all things related to waterborne transportation, China outspends the US by a measure of 2 to 1. So getting back to your point, I think all of the problems we're experiencing right now are a function of decades of underinvestment in port and intermodal connections to move freight. I do understand your specific question about access to markets, particularly by interior state producers. I think on that note, you know, the good news is that, you know, barge and rail car traffic is reaching the ports to be exported overseas. I think the challenges are on the container side and containers not being dispatched to interior point locations. That's a legitimate concern, one where AAPA and some of its leading members have convened with the FMC and others to try to really come up with the best strategy, because of course, all of these shortages in a way take place on the port's footprint, but the ports don't necessarily control all the levers nor the commercial relationships that govern whether or not that empty container gets out to the center of the country to load an export load overseas.
Thank you. Mr. Baker, I appreciate that your testimony mentioned the Railroad Rehabilitation and Financing Innovation Act, which is legislation that I introduced along with Senator Hassan this year to improve the accessibility and viability of the RIF loan program for smaller railroads, including short lines. Could you elaborate on why the current RIF application process presents such a formidable barrier to entry for short line railroads?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. RIF has long, as you know, for decades held this tantalizing promise to help the short line industry invest and grow, and particularly in places like South Dakota, and it's never quite gotten there. And over the last 10 years in particular, RIF has essentially stopped working for short lines. I think your bill would be remarkably helpful. It does a few things that we find crucial. It would streamline the application process. It would extend the length of the loan terms out to as long as 50 years, which would better match the length of the assets. It would increase flexibility regarding collateral requirements, and then perhaps most importantly, it would authorize funds to pay for the credit risk premiums, which would make RIF look and function a little bit more like TIFIA. I don't know if folks would say TIFIA is the world's most successful program, but compared to RIF, it's gangbusters. So we think your bill would be a huge step in the right direction. We appreciate you introducing it.
Thank you. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman, but I look forward to working with you and your organization. It'd be nice to get that enacted. We need that program to be accessible to short lines and smaller railroads in this country.
Thank you, Senator Thune, for your questions. Mr. Connor, my next question is for you. You know, the Great Lakes navigation system is essential to freight mobility in the United States, and there's no question our Great Lakes ports support countless jobs all across the country. I want to talk about one particular piece of critical infrastructure, and that's the Soo locks, which are really the linchpin for the whole system. They're located in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and they connect Lake Superior to Lake Huron. And roughly 80 million tons of cargo pass through the locks each year. most of that is iron ore produced in the United States. That starts up in Minnesota and travels down to Michigan and steel mills all along the Great Lakes, and an essential link in the supply chain for domestic steel production and manufacturing that relies on steel, certainly the auto industry in particular. But there's a major problem that only one lock in the Soo Locks complex, the Po lock, is big enough to handle large cargo vessels. And as a result, the Po lock handles roughly 89% of the total tonnage that transits the Soo Locks. And if the Po lock fails, it would be devastating to the whole economy. In fact, a 2015 report from the Department of Homeland Security estimated that an unanticipated closure of the Po lock would trigger a national recession and would cost upwards of 11 million jobs in the United States. That's why I've fought, along with my colleagues in my delegation, to fund construction of another large lock in that complex that will create the redundancy, mitigate the threat. But we also need to make other infrastructure improvements in the locks. In fact, as I toured the locks of the Corps of Engineers, some of the pumps that pump the water were made back in the early 1900s. That's certainly a testament to how good the Army Corps of Engineers is in keeping things running. But we shouldn't have pumps that are from the early 1900s for a critical piece of infrastructure that could have a devastating impact should it fail. So my question to you, Mr. Connor, is specifically related to that. You've addressed it with the congestion at the ports, but talk to me how important it is to make sure in any infrastructure package we're funding projects like the Soo Locks and other pieces of infrastructure that may not be a port but are an integral link to the mobility system.
Yeah, absolutely. And Senator, you said it so well yourself. The inland waterways are essential movers of goods to coastal ports and to the global marketplace, to and from the global marketplace. And specific to the Soo Locks project, in our $6 billion Army Corps of Engineer ask that I articulated earlier, we're seeking completion funds so that the Soo Locks project can be completed and no longer be a bottleneck for trade. But there are so many essential pieces of the integrated intermodal network from coast to coast that facilitates trade between nations that need to be addressed in this infrastructure package. I think now is the moment to make the commitment to get the spending in place and to prepare this country for not only the next generation, but maybe the next 2 generations, if not 3 generations, so that we can compete in the world economy.
Well, you're absolutely right, Mr. Connor. And another issue that I'd love to have you address here, too, and you talked about that with previous questions related to ports and the crowding that we have, particularly on the east and the west coast, and the needs for significant infrastructure investments. But as you're well aware, we have a lot of smaller ports across this country, and in the Great Lakes, for example, the number of smaller ports where investments, considerably less in terms of dollar amount, investments in those ports could yield huge returns in terms of capacity, and to bring some of that freight up the St. Lawrence Seaway and into the heartland, and then to connect with rail and trucking and other assets. What is your sense of the necessity for us to make sure that we're funding infrastructure improvement projects in smaller ports located across our country, but in particular those in the Great Lakes that historically have always been a major center of commerce?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I would cite what I said to Senator Baldwin earlier. You need only to look at the PIDP process over the last couple of years, and the subscription for that program was in excess of $1 billion each year. So it by 4-fold exceeded the amount of the appropriation to get a sense of the need from ports of all sizes, including many of the smaller to mid-sized ports that you're referring to, including those in the Great Lakes, who are seeking to improve their port infrastructure so that they can be more efficient and more competitive in the global marketplace. So it's a huge priority and something we're a big fan of. PIDP. We'd be an even bigger fan if we could see that dollar appropriation get significantly higher.
And one final point related to that point. In your testimony, you discussed the challenges that ports have due to CBP screening requirements and resources. Clearly, the Department of Homeland Security and CBP have a really tough job. They have to do two very important things. One, they have to keep us safe, first and foremost. And second, they need to move trade as efficiently as possible across the border. But sometimes smaller ports, smaller facilities have challenges getting the security personnel or the CB personnel necessary to facilitate that trade. In your mind, how can we best balance security concerns and evolving threats with port operations to move freight more efficiently? What should we be thinking about doing?
Yeah, what I mentioned in my opening remarks is, some type of a funding mechanism for CBP so that they can create the kind of infrastructure they need at ports to best do their job. In the absence of that, the trend that we've seen, and has become a growing concern for our members, is a shifting of the cost burden for facility upgrades and for officer shortfalls away from CBP onto the shoulders of the ports. This has gotten very problematic in that it at times comes with concerns over, if the ports don't pony up, that the speed in which cargo is screened will slow down, further compounding the whole freight movement issue we've been discussing here this afternoon. So I think it's incredibly important that we address this, we bring it out into the open, and we find a permanent solution to make sure that CBP has the funds that they can operate true to their original mission.
All right, thank you. Mr. Spear, in my final question here as we wrap up the hearing today, I want to talk a little bit about international ports of entry. And in Michigan, we have two of the busiest ports of entry in North America. In fact, of the top 5 in terms of the volume of cargo that goes across an international border, 2 of them are in Michigan, Port Huron, Sarnia, and Windsor, Detroit. And certainly any kind of infrastructure package requires us to make sure that we're moving that freight more efficiently. And right now, the construction of the Gordie Howe International Bridge is underway to alleviate some of the traffic that is on the current bridge. In fact, you can see trucks just lined up as they try to come across that very, very busy border. So my question to you is, how will investments to enhance capacity at these ports of entry, how is that going to improve your ability of your industry to move cargo and freight in a resilient and timely fashion? And why is it something that should be a priority for us?
Well, I think partnerships are something that I would emphasize, especially when you're looking at crossing borders. You mentioned a significant crossing. I've been to Laredo as well. I've seen 11 to 14,000 a day going across that. It's staggering to watch the dance unfold, and that dance involves a lot of partners. And when you look at the private sector industry, we have a vested stake to move that freight quickly, but safely and securely. And we take that very seriously. The partnerships that we have with DHS, but beyond CBP, we've got FMCSA looking at the safety of that equipment, making certain that those crossing in that aren't U.S. plated are doing it according to the law. These are all rules of the game that we have to play very well. And those that do have very strong understanding of the relationships that we have with our federal law enforcement agencies. So I think we build on those partnerships. I think it builds trust. Creating programs that really underscore efficiency is extraordinarily important. You then toss in good infrastructure and alleviating those choke points, you'll be able to see those partnerships really take advantage of the throughput and also not compromise safety and security. So the infrastructure is important. I also think good trade policy and good tax law is important. You do all those things at the same time, I think you're really coming up with a good recipe. So something that we really underscore, we really want to partner and really have good transparency with our law enforcement partners. We do, and going forward, I think any legislation that you fund or insert any policies, we would look for that to be a leading part of the bill.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Spear. And as this hearing concludes, I certainly would like to reiterate my appreciation and my thanks to each of our witnesses for being here today and offering your thoughts. Certainly, the freight industry is the backbone of the American economy, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on this committee to support workers and to invest in infrastructure so we can ensure a bright future for the industry and for our nation. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks, and any senators that would like to submit questions for the record should do so within 2 weeks. And with that, this hearing is now adjourned.
Thank you.